Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight, everyone. We are going to start the program in just a few minutes, but before we do, we want to give you the opportunity to view the hand-drawn animated film that Mark created as part of this exhibition. It's titled Overture, and it runs for just about 10 minutes. So we are going to run that now, and then we'll get our speakers up to our makeshift stage and begin the conversation. So thank you. Enjoy. Mark Gibson.
Hello? Hello? I can share with you. Here. You're the guest.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Hi. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Berman Museum of Art. I'm Lauren McCardel, Executive Director here at the Berman, and it's an honor to moderate this evening's conversation. Thank you all for being with us tonight. We're gathered here to explore Overture, the powerful and deeply resonant exhibition by Mark Thomas Gibson. Through his dynamic and incisive practice, Mark challenges us to engage with history, collective memory, and the ongoing struggle for justice. This exhibition is a visual, sonic, and kinetic experience, one that compels us to look, listen, and reflect. We're fortunate to be joined by an incredible group of thinkers and creators who have helped bring Overture to life. Artist Didier William and curator Dan Nadel, both contributors to the forthcoming monograph, which we'll talk a little bit about, will offer insights into Mark's practice in the broader cultural and historical contexts that shape it. Composer Emily Wells, who created the score for the film that you just heard, will speak about working together, collaborating, and translating Mark's visual language into sound. I'd like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for their generous support of this program, and of course, thank you all for being here. So I'm going to quickly get through some bios to help you get to know our speakers a little bit more before we hand things over to them. Starting with Mark, which I think who many of you know. Mark Gibson's personal lens on American culture stems from his multifaceted viewpoint as an artist. His myriad and often colliding perspectives fuel his exploration of contemporary culture through languages of drawing, painting, print, and sculpture, revealing a vision of a satirical, dystopian America where every viewer is implicated as a potential character within the story. He received his BFA from the Cooper Union in 2002 and his MFA from Yale School of Art in 2013. He's represented by M&B in Los Angeles and Loyal in Stockholm. In 2016, he co-curated the traveling exhibition Black Pulp with Will Villalongo. He's released 2 artist books, Some Monsters Loom Large and Early Retirement, and of course there is a forthcoming book coming out later this year. There's a lot more that I could read about Mark, but I'd rather you listen to our speakers and not me, so I'm going to move to Emily. Emily Wells wrote and performed the score for Overture. She is a polymathic composer, producer, and video artist who has toured extensively throughout the world, including headlining performances at the Guggenheim Museum, the Lincoln Center, the National History Museum of Los Angeles, Sundance Film Festival, many more. She has released 6 critically acclaimed albums, including 2017's visionary This World Is Too For You, and 2022's complex, vibrant, and dynamic Regards to the End. I'm really excited to hear more from Emily about what the collaboration on this project has been like. Dan Nadel is the curator at large for the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art and a co-curator for a large-scale rethinking of the art history of the 1960s at the Whitney Museum of American Art. He founded and ran Picture Box, which produced over 100 books, objects, and zines from 2000 to 2014, including the Grammy Award-winning design for Wilco's 2004 album, A Ghost Is Born. He also co-founded the magazine Comics and is a former editor of the Comics Journal. And finally, last but not least, Didier William is originally from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. He earned a BFA in painting from the Maryland Institute College of Art and an MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale University School of Art.
His work has been exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami, Bronx Museum of Art, the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, and many, many others. I won't read through them all. He's taught at several institutions, including Yale School of Art, Vassar, Columbia, Penn, and SUNY Purchase, and is currently assistant professor of expanded print at Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University. So, herewith, let me hand things over to Mark to talk a little bit about the show and kick off the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Is this working? Isn't it working? Can you all hear me?
I have one too that works.
Oh, yeah. All right, thanks. Give me one of those. Hello. Yeah, all right. Now I feel it. Thank you, everyone, for coming here tonight. I want to say thank you to the Berman Museum. I also want to say thank you to Deborah. Where are you? Did you come back down yet? And also want to say thank you, Deborah. And I'd like to say thank you to Lauren McCardel as well, who came to my studio a few years ago to talk to me about possibly doing an exhibition here. And at the time, we didn't know what that was going to be, and I think that's kind of how these things develop. You have conversations with people, and then you start mining ideas, and kind of where I started off with this idea of this exhibition isn't exactly where we ended up. The nature of my work tends to come from what's going on in America and American history. I kind of see myself as an American history painter, have been for the last few years, really kind of thinking about what that may mean in the contemporary sense. When I say that, you kind of have to look at the longer track of American history painting, and a lot of it has to do with what is actually happening in the culture at that moment. If it's manifest destiny painting, is it portraiture, is it all other forms of painting in the contemporary in the last 20th century? A lot of it I can say was probably should be considered American history painting. But in my case, I've kind of branched out a little bit more than I otherwise would have wanted. Meaning I've kind of gone more into like video, I've gone into sound, I've gone into, animatronics and other sculpture and other modes of making, but at the same time, I kind of feel it's all within the same family. And along that ride, I've been able to meet really incredible individuals. Partnering with Emily Wells here, who was kind enough when over a year ago when I was sitting there just starting to think about what a hand-drawn animation might be for me to even try to do, and say, I think I'm doing an animation. Did you want to make music with it? And you're like, sure. It wasn't even like a hesitant, not in a second. And that kind of gave me the confidence to even try to pursue it. In my journeys, I've also met Dan Nadel, who was a person for me. When you are a person who loves comics deeply, who loves illustration deeply, who loves narrative art deeply, sometimes in this art world, you don't really meet that many people who have a truly great understanding of how to bridge that into to actually concrete actual art, and what that means. So to be seen by that person and to have a conversation with him and having to also recognize the depth and the importance of the medium. He's been incredible at doing that, and I thank him for being here tonight. And also, I will say to my dear friend Didier, I can't talk about too much, I'll start crying. But because there's some people in your life that always will try to, that really back you on your visions, and without hesitation. And by doing so, you also learn that you can do that for others as well, that it can be reciprocal. I think as artists, and all of you, if any of you here are artists, young artists, the reciprocal nature of being an artist with other people as you move through this world, especially this crazy world that we're in right now, is extremely necessary. And you have to remember, God, I'm thinking a lot about the Beatles. The love you make is equal to the love you take, or the love you take is equal to the love you make. And I've been feeling that a lot lately, and the necessity for it. We're in some really strange times right now. And when I made this show, it opened up January 23rd, just 3 days after the inauguration. A lot of the imagery that's in the show was created before the election even occurred. The Trump head, some of these ideas around melancholia, ideas around space, and a larger conversation for me started coming up where I have these two practices, the town criers that you see out there, where there's this kind of practice of thinking about what's happening in the world and these daily events, and as they're hitting us, and how we forget about them, and how necessary it is for us to actually remember them, and remember what we're losing and what we maybe sometimes are winning. We have to remember that happens every once in a while too. But then we also have to deal with all the losses we have right now. Man, in and out. So when I started working on the show, I started thinking about time larger than myself. I started thinking about ideas of constructs. Like within my education, I felt I learned a lot about deconstructive logic, but I didn't learn much about how to construct or constructive logic. And when I think about this constellation, or I think about this flag, I think about these as agreed upon constructs, things that we've all said have meaning, things that we stand behind, things that we all agree upon, things that we use to navigate ourselves through the world. So when making this animation, a big part of it too, and I find more and more, I'm actually at a really great place in my art because it's harder for me to explain verbally what it is that I'm trying to do to people, or what I'm trying to make. And so people just kind of go yeah, okay. But when I was working on the animation, and I was working with my friend Jesse Austin, who helped with the last part, the 3D animation, and Mike Rader, who helped edit this piece, the main thing was I kind of just had to explain to them, I'm talking about from the macro to the micro to the macro. Things are about perspective. Where you're sitting right now in this room to this video, if you don't look back and forth, these two things actually go out of sync, and the waves start to actually move back and forth between the two sides. But if you're sitting on one side, you're just kind of stuck there, looking at this wave that's just at its crest. There's these little things that I think about how we're all interacting with each other and how we're missing each other. So by the end of the video, I wanted to have this starscape. I wanted to have this light. I wanted to have this thing turn into this other level of perspective, other X-ray, light rays, ways in which we don't actually see connection, the ways we don't see forces of gravity playing upon each other. It's something that I've thought about for a long time, but I've never thought about executing it in any way, shape, or form for people. But this has been my first attempt at least trying to do so. And also thinking about the tidal wave, thinking about in and out, the way in which these things long before us will, and probably, hopefully, long after us will still exist. So that's about as clear as I could be. I was going to give you guys a town crier that I drew today and talk about that, but I think that will be for another day. So with that, I will pass the mic to, who's the first up? To Emily Wells.
Yeah, I got this one working. Yeah.
Well, you're a technical genius.
So I'm just going to dive in because there's so much I could say about this process, so we use our time wisely. I think one thing that differentiates this piece of music, and I'm really glad we all got to sit here and listen to it and watch it together, so I'm not speaking completely abstractly. But I tried, one thing that differentiates this piece, I think, a bit for me, and something that was really unique to creating it with Mark, was that I really tried to approach it as though I were making a painting. And so what does that mean? Every good painter is obsessed with materials, reference, and the play between form and freedom. And I felt like I kept creating form so that I could be completely imaginative and improvisational and have a lot of play, break it, form again, play. So it's just kind of circle that I kept making. And also a lot of interest in sketching and line. A lot of times when I approach a recording, I have a lot of ideas already, especially the form, the basic form, drawn out. But this, I allowed myself to go in with a lot more freedom and a willingness to cover things up, to slash and burn, which also kind of felt really painterly. And also an interest in the visibility of the hand versus a covering of the hand. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. But so our process, I would say, for me at least, besides you asking me and then not mentioning it again for a year. If I would, no, we would, oh yeah, we're gonna do that, we're gonna do that. But then it really kicked off when we had a studio visit together. And what I loved about the studio visit was like, you know, we were talking about our ideas, and we'd been trading music back and forth at this point for a while. But Mark was actually working on this painting here, the constellation flag. We can build a constellation, and you know, he was just sort of casually splattering stars into his universe while chatting with me about our lives, about his dad, about this work in general, about Beethoven, about key signature, all of it, you know. So I got to really, and in some ways I think that was my springboard into the make a song like a painting. And then I asked him to give me some artists to look at while I was making it. So Jacob Lawrence, Kathy Kulowitz, Philip Guston, Aaron Douglas, Charles White, Carrie Walker, Amy Silman, and James Inzer. Maybe we can go to that. Yeah, you're on it, Lauren. And there's this kind of, when you're about to write and record a song, there's always this kind of period of like chaos and stillness that happens. That's this very kind of precarious state, and you have to be sort of careful about what you take in. And I really appreciate Mark's kind of total understanding of that state and willingness to be in it. And also kind of like the best part is the before and during, and a kind of a disinterest in the after in a way. Not that he wasn't interested in what I made, but rather like it really is all for us. I felt like it really was so juicy. And I was kind of realized I had a bit of a record of that process when I was looking back through some of our texts today. So I did not get his consent, so I'm only going to read text from me. But in a Silman hole, or maybe I should say a river. Also, on James Inzer, what a freak. And then I one morning I wrote him, I had the wildest dream last night, was in the Inzer painting and your painting that references it, horrifying. And I kept saying over and over again, Philip Guston, Philip Guston. So that was kind of the before period. So this painting in a way was a real hook for me into the process. If you can go back to the Inzer real quick. Okay, because this is Inzer's Christ's arrival into Brussels, and Mark made this piece, Biden's entry into DC, right around the time when Biden was getting inaugurated. And so I started, you know, if you know Mark's work, you know there are these references of these canon pieces. And I've been working on this Beethoven Pathétique Sonata for like months and months at this point. And it's a kind of piece of music that for me was like super, like strips your ego and you're just so humbled. And you kind of I had to learn it really a measure at a time. And I started thinking about what would it be like to remake that insane Guston maximalist fucking wet dream and in a new form. And you kind of would have to go through it a measure at a time, I imagined. So my instruction was basically just like dark maximalism, which is my idea of a good time. And and so I thought, okay, I want to reference this Beethoven sonata. So I knew I wanted to be in, you know, C minor, for instance. And I wanted to take a tiny little piece of it and have it be like kind of confronting modernity, which in some ways I feel is like what Mark is doing here in this piece, whether that be through color or the introduction of the surveillance. And so I took this little piece. I actually kind of found the most just disconcerting moment of the entire sonata, which is generally really beautiful. And there's this one part that every time I played it, I felt like I was a spider. So I was like, this is the right moment. So I'm going to show you that moment. This is a performance. And you can, just hit it. All right, so I'm curious if you'll hear. We're gonna play the intro. Basically, I performed that. Oh, that's all right. There's a couple of things that are interesting about this piece. One of them is Beethoven has this like obsessive rolling between two notes, octaves, throughout most of the piece, and it's kind of like a wrist killer, you know. And so, and it reminds me of like synthesizers and arpeggiators now that can create this sort of like movement. And so I thought, okay, what if I sample this in and I kind of create a sample out of this one little section. So that's what this beginning part is. And it's like, how can you extend the ability of the human hand? And what do you lose when you extend that ability, and what do you gain? So maybe we'll just play this little moment. So the sampler is speeding it up, slowing it down, depending on where I trigger it from the keyboard. There's the full line. And then chaos ensues from there. And I kind of think of this in like 3 sections. And I was really, really interested in thinking about if this were a painting, perhaps the only part you would see is the end, the final section, and these parts are really the exploration. But because it's music, we get to kind of see the whole process on the page. The next part, you know, there's a lot of water in this work, as you can see all around you. And there's a piece in the back where there's this horse that's drowning, struggling, trying to stay alive. There's a lot of water in your previous show that I had just seen before we started making this. And then, of course, in the animation, there's a lot of water. So I was really interested in the experience of drowning, gasping. So this next section, I used some woodwinds to create that feeling of gasping. They kind of interrupt the chaos of the water. And then the next section is the voice enters. And this next part, again, it's kind of like, how can you extend the hand through the machine? So everything you heard in that middle section is all a sample of my voice. And it was kind of like, through all that gasping, like, is there still a voice present? And the melody kind of arrived like a bell would, and a reminder of a human intuition. The next part, I wanted to feel like stepping on a shore. And when you get out of the water, you're safe, but you also have to confront the grief and the tumult of the water you were just in. And I would say, in a way, that's what this whole last section is. There's a lot of salve, but it is also not without a remembrance of the water. And since we already just like heard everything, I don't know that we need to listen to every clip, but maybe you should just go to the next one. I made this little clip for y'all so you could hear things kind of muted out. There's one conversation, especially between the 2 violins, that I wanted to point out. So you'll kind of hear things come in and out if you want to just... So this is just the piano soloed out, and this is kind of the backbone. It's the first thing I wrote and recorded. And also the percussion. So this is violin 1. Violin 2 enters. You can hear the reediness of the bow. And then these two start, I mean, the whole thing is kind of a conversation between these guys. And then the cello and the viola are just like the cool cats, just holding it down like they know how to do. The support for that conversation. Yeah, I'm going to leave you with one more text message between me and Mark. And this is what I sent, I think when I sent you the recording, or maybe in our mania conversations that ensued after he received the recording. I said, also, I think your work, this show, and the library show, and your Inzer painting have all evoked a kind of urgency in me that I really hear in the recording. And I hope tonight evokes that for all of you as well. So, thank you.
Dan, would you like to advance your own slides, Dan?
What's that?
You can advance your slides if you'd like. Can you hand that to him for me? Thank you so much, Didier.
Thank you.
Should be the, yeah, there you go.
Okay. Tough act to, oh. Oh my. Tough act to follow. But I'll do my best. I am going to read an excerpt from the essay I wrote for Mark's forthcoming book, which I am honored to contribute to. And yeah, thank you all for having me here. And I wrote this essay after meeting Mark and Katie with my wife Elisa for lunch one day in Philadelphia. And Mark was asking Mark some annoyingly personal questions about his life. And he sort of unspooled this incredible story, most of which I will not go into tonight. You'll have to read it yourselves. But all this to say, Mark's an incredible storyteller in person and, you know, in the objects. And so he made writing this both easy in the sense that I knew that there was a story and there were sort of outlines I could follow, but also very difficult because it's a tough standard to live up to, and the layers are seemingly infinite at times. So you never really know where to stop. Mark's work just gives and gives. So I will now read aloud, not silently. Let's see, is this the, yeah. Mark's mature work of the last 7 years or so is a continual journey into the knotty, gnarly depths of historical figures, scenes, and ideas. His 2019, I have these out of order, of course, my fault. His 2019 series of large-scale drawings, which all begin The One, has him in dialogue with primal American scenes. In these drawings, he blends the exaggerated language of the great caricaturist Thomas Nast and the noir renderings of EC comic book artists Johnny Craig and Graham Ingalls. The first time I ever visited Mark, we bonded over our shared love of mid-century drawings of men's shoes. purely for aesthetic reasons, I'm certain. The EC work is at once unbelievably precise, but also woozy and horrific and sometimes drunken. In the one about George Washington, Mark has transformed Emanuel Lewitz's painting, which of course was widely disseminated in copies and prints, and re-examined by 20th and 21st century artists. It becomes a frantic rendering of a rabid George Washington commanding a death ship of boozing, puking soldiers. Death ship, by the way, for you students out there, this is a footnote aside, not in the text. Check out H.C. Westerman's Death Ship series of prints and sculptures. It has a lot to say about America and war. Okay, going back to the essay. The good general is held at bay by the likeness of the artist himself, now literally grappling with history. Part of what makes this and so much of Mark's artwork function is its clarity. The arrangement of bodies and limbs, water, boat, ice, clouds in this drawing are locked in like a jigsaw puzzle. Nothing is out of place, which makes Mark's discrete eruptions of chaos and the grotesque that much more terrible. So, how do you get to that place, to the place of making this kind of work that's informed by so much history, but also so many different kinds of aesthetics, techniques, and ideas? Mark, who's sitting over there, was one of two kids raised in Carroll City, a mostly black and Cuban neighborhood in North Miami. His mother was a secretary and his father a postmaster. He grew up drawing and got formal training at a magnet school and began picking up comic books at grocery stores and pharmacies when he was 8 or 9. This much we have in common. The drawing and the drama of the X-Men and Wolverine, for example, were irresistibly flashy and exciting, and for a kid already learning drawing skills, somehow within reach. Comic book obsessed kids of the 1980s and 90s, like me and Mark, had to follow unbelievably complex continuities across multiple titles and many, many years, memorizing names and powers in order just to keep up. And if you were an especially irritating kid like I was, you would corner your friends and quiz them on the relative powers and strength of your favorite superheroes. Not recommended if you're looking to make friends. Some of us wound up with a knack for memorizing lengthy stories and fetishizing the brisk lines that delineate them. And then you add in a steady diet of other geek kid material, like Monty Python's Flying Circus, and of course, Paul Verhoeven's masterpiece, RoboCop. And suddenly a view of the world comes into focus. A place of endless overlapping narratives of varying degrees of veracity, absurdity, horror, liberation, oppression, and of course, humor. Kids like us, I guess I'm being generous with myself, kids like us like to depict the action they remember, the action they can play out in front of them. And for Mark, ultimately, history was where the action was and is. For a boy moving all the way through high school, getting rigorous training in the hand skills of art, he could see it on the page in front of him. He could see how this thing was made, this thing he was learning that was history. Mark attended Cooper Union in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and eventually Yale's painting and printmaking MFA program. The thing about Mark that has been so interesting in getting to know him is, like me, perhaps tragically, but also inspiringly, he believes in art and in images as living things, with the intensity of someone who has lost his faith and then found it again, but this time without any contingencies, without any sort of quotation marks or couching. Mark's epiphany, if we could call it that, about the meaning of art and what it could do came in graduate school. When he remembered a portrait painting of Benjamin Franklin by Joseph Duplessis. And he realized that there was no way that that white man looked like that at 60 or 70 years old living in the Northeast. That skin, Mark pointed out to me, is way too smooth. It's fair. It's true. He's right. No, he's right. He knew better. Here was the visual untruth that could spark something else. And returning to Franklin's autobiography, which he had read earlier, he began to understand how images and words could manipulate history and the public. Mark took the strategy and used it on the man himself. He began with the monocolor paintings of Benjamin Franklin, initiated as an exercise in Ad Reinhardt's monochrome painting theories, which is the painting on the right there. Mark created a dialogue around both his subject matter and the form of painting, and also the history of painting, of course. His engagement with the question of how to make a painting became inextricable from the question of what he was making. And that duality you see in this room. I mean, who else has made flag paintings like this? Because they're not exactly flag paintings. There's a subject of a flag, but the way they are made creates an impression that makes us focus on the symbology over any particular kind of material. It's quite amazing how Mark's technique of rubbing and almost like a homespun printmaking technique allows us to focus. But Mark's not a formalist. He understands the currency of image making. He's not telegraphing a quote-unquote disenchantment of the world through painting, as in the lineage of Frank Stella to Christopher Wool to Jacqueline Humphreys. Nor is he offering what a friend described to me as what you see is what you see, deadpan horizon of the postmodernism in the early aughts. Mark instead looks to Robert Colescott, Carol Walker, and other image makers who embrace pictorial meaning and ask if the pictures we've trusted might be at best untrustworthy, then how might we go about creating a new catalog of pictures? This goes to what Mark was just saying a minute ago, which was sort of how do we construct as opposed to deconstruct? That Mark wants to add to history, to, in a sense, compete with it. And I always like a competitive artist, because I'm competitive, and it's something we're not really supposed to do in the arts, because of course it's not a competition, but it actually is. I mean, you don't get graded on, well, it's rough out there. Let's not kid ourselves. Happily, he may be a little pessimistic, Mark, but he is not a nihilist. Not like those guys in The Big Lebowski, those nihilists. They'll cut you. He is too much of a historian to want to blow up the whole thing. Rather, he wants to add to and reshape it in the process. So he does this in multiple ways. There are moments of the everyday, as in this wonderful painting, this one of my absolute favorite paintings of Mark's, The Boys, a perfectly happy painting of a boy popping a wheelie as the world gusts by. And of course, it was painted during COVID, so it's sort of thus the distance and the screen, the sort of scrim of it all. There are heart-wrenching narratives, as in Suspension of Disbelief from 2023, in which the artist imagines himself to be a janitor, for they were all people of color in that building, in that Capitol building, after the January 6th insurrection, cleaning up the mess left by the unruly white mob and our leaders cowering underneath the table. And there are moments using the language of caricature, the language of Thomas Nast, such as rally jams, and that examines an event, in this case the scrum of a rally conflated with the chaos of the insurrection, that he memorializes of movement as surely as Leutze memorialized the idea of democracy at that moment. Since 2021, as you all have seen in the earlier room, Mark has made his town crier drawings as a way to process our ever-accelerating world events. And these works, at times posted daily to Instagram, Mark draws himself in the 19th century uniform of a town crier, very fittingly given the location, Philadelphia, declaiming the day's events in bold slashing letters. The proportion of words to town crier is reflective of the sheer volume of information Mark is processing. The town crier is, as we often are, bowled over by it all. These drawings happen in a single sitting as Mark struggles to understand, reconcile, and process it all like a one-man news machine. The backgrounds often function as sites for material experimentation and rubbing color fields and ink washes. I'm going to stop there, actually, because that's the show, and I've talked a lot. And Didier is waiting very patiently. You're very welcome.
I have toddlers at home, so I'm well practiced at being very patient. Thank you, everybody. I love that Dan mentioned printmaking because it reminded me of a conversation I don't even remember. I think it was probably like 2012, 2013. It was around your show at Frederickson Fraser, and you were like, Didier, I was doing this thing in the studio, and I put the canvases down, and I dump paint all over them, and then I grab a squeegee, and I drag it across them. He was like, it's a totally new way of painting. I was like, Mark, that's a collograph. There's like a whole history of it in printmaking. There's books written about it. And I think it's an important thing to mention because to Dan's point about the way iconography and the surfaces of these paintings function, there is a kind of questioning of evidentiary material that I think is really critical to how Mark thinks through the relationship between history and mythology. And as he self-identifies as a history painter, my personal interest in conversations around history, particularly history as material for art makers, is where does the line sort of occur between when that history becomes or posits itself as a kind of stable archive and when it begins to disintegrate. And really it's the question of power. That's the sort of fulcrum or the distinction between history and mythology. And when I came in and saw the show earlier this week, I immediately texted Mark and said, oh my God, mythology and fantasy and magic. And those elements have been in Mark's work in previous examples, but I think this exhibition at the Berman leans much more heavily into that territory. And I'm also going to read an excerpt from what I wrote for the essay, as Dan did. And I could probably do this without my notes, but as I said, I have a 5-year-old at home, so my memory's not reliable. The most exciting thing about Mark's exhibition here at the Berman for me is what I'm observing as a more deliberate turn towards mythology and fantasy in Mark's work. Mark is a self-identified history painter, and I think one of the things he does exceptionally well is he leverages the vulnerability of the historical narrative, particularly as it attempts to shape constructions of identity and belonging. Even though it's on full display here at the Berman for this exhibition, it's by no means a new component of his practice. In Uncle Sam Eating His Son, the painting to our left, or my left, your right, here we see one of Mark's characters adorned in the classic red, white, and blue garments of Uncle Sam. The Uncle Sam illustrations are believed to have originated in 1812 and became an iconic propagandistic image of American patriotism meant to personify the federal government and convince young able-bodied men to enlist in the armed forces. Here, Uncle Sam is shown echoing the composition of Saturn Devouring His Son by Peter Paul Rubens in 1636. We're also reminded of Francisco de Goya's version of the Saturn Devouring His Son, made approximately in 1823. In Rubens' version of the painting, In Rubens' version of the work, Saturn is depicted hunched over, holding his staff, biting into the chest of the small child. In Goya's version of the painting, Titan is depicted ripping the head and arms off of one of his children. In both versions, Titan's wrath is born out of a fear of a prophecy by Gaia that one of Saturn's children would overthrow him. In Gibson's painting, Uncle Sam's character attempts to take a bite from the chest of what appears to be a small, naked black child. However, Uncle Sam struggles to carry the muscularity in the Rubens original or the snarling wrath and the voracious appetite of the Goya remake. Gibson's Uncle Sam seems swallowed up by the oversized blue coat covering his hunched back. He seems to need the aid of the flagpole gripped tightly in his right hand to keep himself upright while holding the child in his left hand. Uncle Sam's small, narrowly pursed lips seem limp and ineffectual. He appears to struggle to break the muscular child's skin in Gibson's version. His right leg, balancing on the ball of his foot, appears to be unsteady and almost quivering under the weight of the child in his arms. In Rubens' Saturn, the context of the event is celestial. The clouds surround Saturn as he attempts to bite into the small child. In Goya's version of the painting, we appear to be in a darkened cave. The context of the event is almost completely darkened background. By comparison, the space in Gibson's painting explodes into a splattered color field of greens, yellows, and blacks. Gestures and marks direct the viewer's gaze outward from the center, as if the artist is suggesting that we are only witnessing the aftermath of the racialized calamity taking place in front of us. This work is a collision of three different mythologies: race as an operative, albeit fictive, conceptual device; Saturn as a scornful father so anxious about being dethroned that consuming his child seems like his only option; and patriotism as a kind of evidence of abstract belonging. What's most compelling to me here is how Gibson is able to not just overlap, but intersect these three mythologies in this work. In so doing, he makes legible the ways in which we often use myth to rationalize violence and atrocity. And to be clear, here I'm using myth broadly defined, myth as historical narrative, myth as fantastical fiction, myth as religion, myth as a mirror to life. The work is an example of not only the interwoven and perhaps inextricable relationship between mythology and archival history in Mark's work specifically, but also the formation of race as a mythological construction. Such a concise and clear narrative mashup between history and myth appropriately captures the fraught role that race often plays in the American historical imaginary. I think to talk about race and its conceptual origin story as inherently fictive without sacrificing its horror and brutality is an incredibly fine needle to thread. Over the years, I've seen Mark work continuously at sharpening that line of inquiry. This exhibition at the Berman continues that trajectory, and I think Dan alluded to this, but one of the ways in which Mark has so adeptly been able to do that is by sort of straddling these different territories that formally include, and I think Dan said, either Dan or Emily said, Mark's not a formalist. I might slightly disagree that I think he actually is a staunch formalist, because I think he so adeptly vacillates between painting, printmaking, now sculpture, and even animation in such a way that the language itself becomes complex. The surfaces of these paintings question painting as a kind of document, symbolism and iconography as evidentiary material, and friction as a trace of time and a container of an experience, which I think is an essential thing to sort of bring to the fore as someone who's interested in painting history and manipulating, using history as source material. And so with that, I will end, and hopefully we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Didier, Dan, Emily, and Mark. So we have a little bit of time left, and I do have some questions, but I don't know, have the four of you been together in the space before?
No.
Cool. So I wonder if you all have any questions for each other that we might use to kick this discussion off before we hand it over to questions from the audience. And if not, if none come readily to mind, I can start us off.
Yeah, why don't you start us off? I mean, I'm just sitting here thinking about like the relationship I have with each one of these individuals, but also how, I guess kind of speaking to what Didier was describing, but how almost how many different like little odd aspects I have inside of me, I guess, and that each one of you have kind of like shown me that element a little bit more. I mean, like really oddly, Emily, the music that you made for this is like that's the music in my head. Like that's how kind of my brain kind of like goes. And I mean, I'm just feeling that tonight with all of you, a deep level of appreciation for having the opportunity to work with all of you in every capacity. So I just want to say thank you. But yeah, but please ask your question.
Well, I think I might just want to tug a little bit on the thread that you were just talking about, Didier, thinking about mythology and connecting to some of Mark's earlier works, which several of you did, which draw on direct references. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the work in this show and correlations that we see, given that context that you just talked about and sort of the influence of that broad definition of mythology that you talked about. And maybe, you know, how you think about that, Mark, with regard to this body of work. Emily, how, if you thought about that at all, or how you did when thinking about the score, and if we could just kind of like unpack that a little bit.
I mean, I can give you my quick thoughts about that. I mean, I was thinking about it a lot. I was thinking about like storytelling and how we will tell the story of a moment that we're in right now, how that story will be written. It's very complicated because I feel that we're in a story that's being unwritten as we're trying to live it, and it's very destructive in its making, meaning that it's crazy to me to think that someone believes that this individual who's the president right now is actually doing anything. He's just deconstructing everything. He's just breaking things. He's not building anything. He's just breaking things. He's just destroying lives, removing people from spaces, firing people, shutting down offices, like limiting opportunities. Nothing is being created. It's just destructive. But I think that there's this idea of image that he believes in and that many of his ilk believe in, that if they create the facade and the image, that there will be a mythology, there will be a story to be told. There will be somebody who will sit there and say, oh, something great came of this, something amazing came of this. You know, they'll try to own that space too. It's almost like when you eliminate a space and you create so much kind of a void, what will exist inside of that void? So when making that effigy of him, and I call that piece paperweight, because he loves to refer to people's weight, you know, like that's a lightweight person or a heavyweight person or something like that, but he's a paperweight. And then to remove his nose, you know, just to think about this idea of that damnatio gesture of like, this individual will not always exist. He's mortal. I wanted people to be able to pick him up, and I wanted them to hold him in his hand and realize that he is mortal. He will not always be here. But the stories that we tell, the narratives that we create, the things that we remember, that's why I write things down, because we forget. So we don't have that information, or our experience supplanted by someone else's information. You know, segregation, I mean, this dude just, you know, banned like federal agencies to consider like segregation anymore. So now like restaurants that were made under federal contractors can be segregated again. That happened in February. You're just hearing about it now. You know, like water fountains segregated again. Like stuff that my dad had to go through is happening to you right now. So what story are we going to create? What kind of new myth? You know, how do we form that? How do we negotiate that? So that was some of the things I was thinking about when building this before all this happened. I just had an inch, you know, I just was like, we need to start thinking about what are we trying to build here?
And if I can
Go for it.
jump in, Mark, I think that's the thing that kind of smacked me in the face when I walked into the exhibition on Monday. Knowing your work, knowing your trajectory, and how the work has evolved, this was the first time where I've seen a kind of deprivileging of mimesis and information transaction, and a kind of centering of a speculative sort of futurism that was palpable and powerful and spatial. I mean, the flood as a kind of icon of an alternative condition of being right away was like, it was guttural. There was something super guttural about it. And I think, as you talk about yourself as a history painter, and I think as you're often discussed as a history painter, I think anyone who's interested in sort of disentangling history has to also think about how history is subverted. Thinking about history is also a question about who has power and who doesn't. And oftentimes we have to think about not only who has power, but how is power subverted, and how do we sort of engage in acts of refusal in order to subvert those in power who render us under threat. And mythology functions as one of the ways in which to do that, right? In almost every civilization around the world, we can find it as this sort of tool of survival, as this way for people to sort of speculate about the world that they might want to live in, or the world that they once lived in. And it becomes this way in which to imagine something on the other side. And this, I think we can think about individual paintings, but even as a space, right? I think you responded really well to this sort of rotunda in the middle. And when I sat on the bench looking at the video, I immediately sat on the bench closest to this side, but looked at that video and wanted to sort of experience that spatial dimensional gap that existed between me and the projection. And so, all of that to say is I think that this was the first sort of tangling with that element of mythology that I found really powerful. And as Dan mentioned earlier, speaking to any of the students in the room, it's something that's really hard to teach. It's something that's really hard to teach folks how to like visualize that, right? Like, where do you find the visual information, and how do you construct space, and how do you think about the surface of the painting as a sort of alternative object, and all this sort of stuff. And I think this is a sort of prime example of how to do that really, really well.
I agree, and also that's beautifully said. And I've just been completely gobsmacked by these flag paintings, which you were texting me images of, and even though you'd sent me images, but I wasn't really prepared for how effective they are. And I had a question also. I mean, there's a great history of flag paintings that you are engaging with, of course. Jasper Johns, no slouch, but Hammond's, of course, and God, so many. But I wondered if what struck me as the edge is that you're not playing the illusion game. Like, you're not saying, is this a flag? Or not. It's a painting of a flag. So the fact that you're showing I don't even know what that's called. What is that called at the edge of a flag? Where you put the grommets.
I forget the name. I
want to call it a spine or something, but that's not what it is. But what made you choose that to sort of as a through line of all the paintings?
Yeah, like an odd grounding element. Yeah, when building that and building that into the canvas and building it into the surface of the painting, it was one part where I knew that other elements I could kind of like play around, but I always wanted there to be a little bit of a sleight of an anchor, or that little deception of like, are we looking at a picture space, or are we looking at a flattened space? It's like that ledge in like a Renaissance painting that you need to kind of like look out into the world. So it's a jumping off point is what I was thinking about when doing it. But by putting it into the corner of the painting in the periphery, then it's a little bit less of like you need to cross this threshold to enter into this space. You're there.
You're in it.
You're in it. And then there's a little bit of a reference back to your own physical world that offers, the kind of materiality of like the painting itself, like scaling these to the dimensions of painting, of flag. But this one kind of just breaking that all open altogether and just kind of going more into I knew the painting I'm referencing for that actual dimension, but I'm not going to get into it. But it's like there's a painting that I'm referencing in that scale. But generally, even with the flag, the big one out there, which is called like the big one, but there was like I should have called it Big Red, but I didn't think about it at the time. But it was just like I knew I wanted to have this flag, and I knew I wanted the wave to kind of take you out. And so when making that painting, it was more like that was like the first one I think I executed out of all of these, and it was like, can this gesture that I've been doing on paper, can it actually go onto a canvas, and can I do it in one shot? So like a lot of it sometimes for me is also this idea of like trust. Like I believe a lot in falling forward when making an artwork. So there's things that happen inside of it that I'm just kind of like, okay, this could either destroy it or it could keep it alive. And sometimes I think there's things in this room that didn't maybe cross that threshold the way I wanted to, but I still want it to live in the world. Yeah.
But you know what else happens in these paintings that I think is really powerful, and I think Dan is picking up on it. There's compression in these paintings, but not resolution. And I think it comes from your sourcing print techniques, because that's what happens when you push something through the press, right? The press takes those various layers and squishes them like this and lays them tightly on top of each other, but they never resolve. They sit next to each other, and then your job becomes really sort of extrapolating and sourcing the productive material tensions that exist between those edges. And I think that's what happens in these works so remarkably well. That's very different from some of the previous work.
Yeah, God, that's so right on, because I was trying to think, I was looking at that painting on the other side of the door and like trying to figure out, like at first I thought, God, did Mark stitch together different pieces of canvas here? I couldn't quite figure it out, but it's the printmaking, and it is this refusal to resolve it, so that it's totally on us to deal with it. But on the other hand, it's completely finished.
Yeah.
Like it's not like a feint at irresolution. It's a complete gesture. It just happens that we have to deal with it, which is a really tough thing to pull off, but also quite wonderful for us.
And Dan, I'm glad you showed the Benjamin Franklin paintings from what, like 10 years ago those were? And I think those paintings were concerned with some of the same things, but those paintings were so indebted to picture making. They were so sort of reliant on picture, wonderful, phenomenal paintings, but so reliant on a kind of sequential storytelling that they didn't do the sort of upending temporal work that these do.
Yeah, I think they leave a lot of space. And their simplicity and their repetition allows the viewer to fill in all the things they already know. Like you look at them and you already understand them without having to explain it to yourself. And for me, it's obviously it's all about the water. I was that horse, like over and over again, I was in the position of being that horse. And I think the restraint of not inserting more characters gives so much more power to that one horse. And also, there's the suffocation of the flood, but then there's the infinity of the galaxy. I was out in Utah recently, and I was in what's called a dark sky city. Only so many lumens are allowed, and I could see more stars than I knew existed. And I remember feeling so grateful to be that small and to understand how small I was in a real physical sense. And I think this is an attempt at that kind of showing us our smallness. That's what I take in so many ways, being among these paintings.
Beautiful.
That was a part of it. Yeah, that was a part of it, but it was also not like, I think there's ways in which we can think of ourselves as being small and then make that in our culture would mean you're powerless. Sure. And like there's nothing you can do. Yeah. It's a gift in a way to understand like the vastness of the universe and the vastness of time and like all those energies and all those things that are happening. And I think that when I can think of those who seek or think that they're in power are also under that same condition, then there is not that much that needs to happen to remove them from that condition. It's hard to understand, okay? How I'll say it like this. It's like I've been in odd roles of power just because I was in the right room at the right time and said the right thing. And when you're in those moments, for me, luckily, my brain didn't all of a sudden think that my body held that position and that was comfortable there, that it made sense for me to be there, and I should always just be there because I'm blessed like that. But it made me understand that this is ephemeral, that this is just a condition. And so that if I truly believe that, then that means it can be altered. So if we're dealing with situations inside of our society that seem insurmountable, I can only think about what my father and his family and the family that goes back before that, how either some people have this idea that we are just in it and we're just screwed, but also we can look at it, we're in it and there's possibility. I believe in chaos. I believe in chaos reigns. I'm a person who functions very well under chaos for some reason. Maybe because, well, that's a whole nother story that Dan wrote about. But it's like I think that I've always had this natural gift for when my mother always said when it hits the fan, always look around and keep your head. Don't completely freeze, but look around. I think there's something about time. I think there's something, with the music, with the sound, and that coming into relationship with the animation that I was making and I was developing, I was thinking a lot about these two separate things that our brains will make whole time together. It will merge it. But then, if anything, there's parts where it can actually separate and break if you allow yourself to focus on one element over the other. If we can learn how to position ourselves to actually break our brain from the way that we see time and the way that we are perceiving it right now, there are other ways and other options that are then possible. It sounds maybe cuckoo to some. For some of you, you might be like, yeah, right on. That's the way I always work. But I think, and I've experienced it enough times, to see that I'm living maybe sometimes in a time that other people aren't. As a creative, and as a maker, as a writer, as a musician, as a painter, you are making things often months in advance before anyone will ever see it. I think about that. I think about my friends who work in television and movies and production, and they're working on a movie 2 years in advance, like The Mummy, which was horrible. When my friend showed me the trailer for that, I was like, oh man, that's gonna be garbage. But I was like, that's recorded. But it was I thought to myself, you already are ahead of that failure. You already see and know what that will become before people even know it even exists in the world. A lot of us don't understand that we have that power within our jobs, within what we're doing in our daily lives, that we actually are projecting out somewhere. No one actually knows yet what we are and what we can be and what we can become. So if we can live with that perception, then what can't we do? That's what I think about a lot. Anyway.
This feels like a good moment at which to open the conversation up a little bit. We're a little over time, but I think we'd like to stay for a few questions.
Yeah, I can ask questions.
From the audience.
Yes, please.
So this is a general question for who have worked with you. What has inspired you since any of you guys? What has inspired you about Mark and his whole entire history of going through this now?
The question is, what's inspired the other people on the stage? What about Mark has inspired you?
Yeah, I think it's just the willingness to get in the mud and just be in it. And you kind of are in the conversation with Mark from the moment you are in the space with Mark. There is no in between. And when you're out of it, the conversation continues. And you just kind of know he's game. I think for me that's been it's also a great way to collaborate because it's a non-oppressive way of approaching collaboration. It's really just about lighting fires and trusting that fire is going to go where it needs to go, and not trying to do a controlled burn, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. Anybody who knows Mark can tell you he's granular, almost like a fractal. Anything he's looking at, it sort of continues to expand and open up the deeper he researches it, the deeper it opens up. And then that thing has 5 other legs, which he researches equally deeply. And it's really a model for a kind of curiosity that I think is rare now, really, really rare. And we could talk about all the reasons why that's rare, but it's a way of making and thinking that I really think is necessary to do the kind of work that we want to do, and to really allow the form to sort of lead any sort of predetermining language that might come before it. I think Mark's practice is a really great model for that, particularly as he now sort of expands into sculpture, animation, and time-based media beyond sort of discrete painting.
Another question over here?
I'm kind of nervous.
Don't be nervous.
You guys are some cool ass people. I'm really new to art. I'm not a very artsy person, but this has been very, like, it's got my brain hurting, man. And it's just making me think where you guys come from your creative spaces, and like, how do you not get stuck? Or of course you get stuck, but how do you get through that, or how do you experience that, if that makes sense?
I love that question. I really love that question, and I think the thing you have to do is to get things out of your head as quickly as possible. Don't think about facility. Try not to think about facility. Try not to think about acuity, but get it out of your head in the most rudimentary way as soon as you can. And I think I'm saying this as a teacher, but I'm also saying it as a dad to a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I watch them turn the couch into a flood, turn the paper towel holder into a sword, turn a blanket into an ocean. And they're not concerned with how accurate it is, not concerned with how good it is, but the world making happens instantly because they don't sort of have the baggage of facility and all the other things that tell us whether or not we're good enough, right? And so they're able to get the thing out of their head and start to give it language right away, particularly important for them at a moment where they're building language. So I think I'd use that as a teaching tool for students, to get students to understand when you're engaged in this kind of narrative world making, don't wait until you are an incredibly accomplished painter and draftsman to get the thing out of your head. Get it out of your head as quickly as you can, because while it's in here, you're canceling it out with all kinds of insecurities and fears and anxieties. But once you get it out, language can start to take shape.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as somebody like, I mean, I don't draw or play music, but writing, I tend to, you have to allow yourself to you have to sort of humiliate yourself in front of yourself. So I just write. I just sit down and write and write and write, and it's mostly horrible. But otherwise, I'm stuck because I'm just stuck in my head. And if that doesn't work, I often will open an email and address it to myself or to whomever, and I just write a letter or an email or a text thread or whatever, and that usually opens up whatever needs opening. So I never sort of sit on my hands, because that's really the way of that's just you just go. And then worry about it later. That's the nice thing about making things, is you can always worry about it later. But you can only sort of get moving,
Yeah, there has to be a willingness to fail, I think, for sure. But also to remain oriented or pointing in the direction of the work, even if you're not making the work, I think is really important. So if that means you go on a walk, it doesn't mean you then just chat on the phone or look at your phone or whatever. You're still pointed toward the thing you're making, even when you're sort of turning your mind off from it, or off from the materiality of making it. And there's so much discovery in that process. It's kind of like what I was talking about, that the still chaos before you actually make something. And to kind of recognize that feeling, and the more you do it, the more practice you'll have at knowing what that feeling is.
And sometimes that feeling, I don't know if anybody else ever has
Absolute
this
dread.
feeling. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
dread. And it's also, I don't know if anybody ever has this feeling before you go to bed when you start to feel yourself nodding off and you go, like that. Maybe it's just me. It's just my existential
No,
dread.
I can totally recognize. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's a similar feeling when you're making something, because you're like, and then you feel much better
But
once
I think you're also like more porous in that state. So like, think about what you're taking in, because it will influence you.
And practice can get you out of that dread. I mean, Mark and I went to the same high school, and we were both sort of beaten into this idea that your sketchbook is with you at all times, you're drawing at all times, you're boom, there you go, right on cue. And so when it becomes a practice, when it becomes an extension of your body, that dread immediately falls away, because then there's a fluid through line between what's up here and what comes out of your hand. And I know, Mark, what you guys don't see in this room is I think at now 3 books you've produced.
Well, 2 I've made,
and one on the
and
way.
then the one that there's this monograph I'm doing, but then I've just decided to get back on the horse with this project that I started a while back.
And these are books that are 200-300 pages long.
Yeah.
That really serve as, I think, the sort of foundational material that then produce his exhibitions. That's one of the things that I think we haven't talked about tonight, is that for every exhibition that you guys see of like 5 or 6 paintings or whatever, there's hundreds of images that Mark has made, tucked away, put aside, are on. If you go to his studio, there's flat files upon flat files upon flat files. And that's where all of that material that Dan and Emily are referring to happens. That's where all of that like cooking happens.
Yeah, I mean, I do think about cooking definitely when I'm baking, but I also like to that question about like nervousness or like kind of going off the path or not feeling like you're in it with the work. It's like I know that there's days when I just don't have it and it's just not there for me, right? And I don't try to. I used to beat myself up about it, and then I realized that like it will not. Some days it's not going to be there, and some days it will be. It's ebb and flow. And so there are moments though where I definitely, when I'm feeling it, I would used to yell out like "surfs up," because I was just like, finally I can get back on the wave of it, like I'd feel it in the studio and I'd be like, ha ha, and I'm like, I'm back on, and all of it's humming. But it's like, then I used to get so bummed when the tide would go out, and I'd just be like, man, is it ever coming back? It's never coming back, is it? Oh man, that was the last wave. And like that was like something that I had to like then realize that like, no, it always comes back if I come back. If I'm there to meet it, it will be there. And I remember there was this conversation years and years ago about painting that was like this symposium with Carol Dunham and Chuck Close. And at first the Chuck Close part, when I was younger, I was like, I don't know, that sounds so dry. But he was like talking about like showing up. Just like showing up in the studio, showing up when you don't really exactly know what you're going to do, when you don't. If you don't know what you're going to do that day, clean up. If you know what you're going to do that day, prep some surfaces. Do the preparatory work so that when the thing comes in, then all of a sudden you're just ready to go and you can just dance. Like that's the way I think about it often. We have room for one more question and then we got to roll?
I think we can do one more.
One more.
Yeah.
First, I wanted to say thank you guys for everything that you said so far. It was very interesting. But in the conversation earlier, when we were talking about the myths that are told and different things like that, image that came to my mind is the Manifest Destiny picture, and how it's told like this sort of, the disgusting genocide that we literally found in this country, and how it's portrayed in this artwork as an angel coming through it and helping the colonizers to connect America from coast to coast. And I was just relating that to the different art pieces and things like that. And I was wondering, sort of back to your point, as you were saying, history is being unwritten as we are kind of going through it in those moments. And how
Yeah. So there's that one image of Manifest Destiny I think you might be talking about where she's like very large and there's a bunch of like wagons that are following behind her. And it's actually the same image that Daniel Arsham used to like do the portrait or the sculpture of Facebook guy. Zuckerberg, his wife. It's based on that image of think about it. So, and we're in this age where like the current president like said that during his inauguration that this will be a new time of manifest destiny. Like this is another, form of expansion that he's thinking about. I think knowing your history, I think sometimes knowing history or being interested about history, understanding the references and the images, the frustrating thing is that not everyone does know. And I think you have to have some kind of humility and understanding that there's a crap load that you don't know either. So then when I try to explore and explain things to people, I used to get really upset. I used to get like, how do you not know this? Like, I live with this. I think about this every day. Like, why do you not know this? This is fundamental. This is the reason why you have those shoes on. Like, this is why these lights are on. Like, this is why this whole thing is built this way, These chairs, all of it. And then I realized that like I maybe am obsessed, but I also, my mind and my perspective is keyed that way. And so then that gave me the ability to then start to key in those voices and those people around me that also maybe are keyed that way. Not as a way to be an isolationist, not to just create a little island of just those who think like me, but to also think about like people who maybe can see the things that you see and also see things that you don't see. And that allowed for me then to, when I make the work, I'm just I used to think about it as like an arms race. And then I realized my arm is getting tired. I can't do it all the time. But I realized that if I am putting it out there, and if I do believe that objects in the world, or that one painting that hangs on that wall that you were talking about, has that kind of significance to telegraph that narrative, then I have to believe the same for my own work. I have to believe that what I do and what I make and what I produce, I have seen it. Like things that I've made that I have now no ownership over, that they exist out in the world, and I know they're affecting people in some way. That's the belief thing that Dan was talking about. Like when I quit making art for 7 years and I came back to it, and that I came back with that belief that like this matters. It just does, and then. It sounds maybe a little silly, but I believe it. So then I just do it. And so even when I'm making something and I'm like, if I don't make that little man's head, it's going to drive me, I'm always going to know why I didn't. That's going to drive me nuts. So I have to do it. I have to get it out of me. And then I actually can sleep. Then that little like thing doesn't happen to me when when I try to go to bed at night.
Mark, can I add something to that?
Go for it, and then we got to close up, though.
Tell your story to yourself. Don't privilege anyone else's legibility other than your own. And that's hard to do, right? That's a lot of unlearning. There's a lot of bravery. That's a lot of vulnerability. But in the beginning, center your own legibility above all else. One of the most important art experiences I've ever had was I had two paintings that were in a show like 10 years ago, and I showed them in Miami, and they were, unlike the rest of the paintings in the show, those two paintings were titled in Creole. And since the show was in Miami, my family came. And my parents and my aunts made a beeline for those two paintings and pretty much stayed there the entire time. They didn't venture around, they didn't socialize, they stayed there, started speaking Creole, created a tertiary condition for themselves, and were laughing, causing a ruckus, disturbing my networking that I was trying to do. But it taught me this lesson about what I wanted to center in my work, what kinds of legibility, what kinds of opacity. Dan mentioned refusal earlier. What kinds of refusal were important and productive in the work? And I think in the beginning, that come from centering your own legibility above all else.
Thank you for those questions. Thank you to our speakers. I mean, it's been incredible to hear each of the three of you talk about what Mark's work has meant to you and how you've responded to it, but also just to hear about your own creative processes and challenges and how you've grappled with those. I don't think I'm just speaking for myself when I say how truly special that is as an experience for all of us. So thank you for being so authentic. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. do keep an eye out for that publication that we've been talking about all night, the monograph on Mark. Will be coming out later in the year. It's available for pre-sale on our website, and Didier's essay, Dan's essay, an interview with Mark will all be included. I think it's going to be a really special publication. So pick one up.